Okay, welcome to part two of our discussion of virtue ethics. Now remember that in our first lecture, we discussed our theory of the right and our theory of the good. Our theory of the right stated an action performed in a certain situation is right if and only if it is an action that a virtuous agent acting in character would perform in the situation in question. So again, we're looking at the question of what would the virtuous agent do in the situation. Our conception of the good is that eudaimonia, or happiness or flourishing, is the highest good in human life. Now, you may recall that we began the last lecture by discussing ways in which virtue ethics sees itself as being different from other forms of ethics, primarily consequentialism and deontology. It's now helpful for us to take a look at what it is that virtue ethicists argue is incomplete about those other forms of ethics. There are three primary ways how virtue ethicists object to other forms of ethics and believe that virtue ethics is ultimately superior to those other forms. First, they argue that other theories are too abstract with regards to principles and rules. Principles such as utility or the categorical imperative are difficult to grasp. Virtue ethics states that its principles are far more concrete. That is, that when we look at particular persons and we think about virtuous action, that this is easier for us to grasp than other theories. When we abstract away from reality, according to this theory, we lose essential elements of ethics and of ethical behavior. Our second major objection. Other theories are too reductive. That is, they seem to make morality based only on one relevant feature, which is not representative of reality. But one thing that we've seen with our discussion of moral pluralism is that a pluralistic version of ethics, including virtue ethics, may be more applicable to reality, which in itself is remarkably complex and ambiguous and so forth. So therefore, if we reject other forms of ethics by saying that the monism involved in those ethics ultimately leads us to incorrect views of ethics and moral dilemmas, virtue ethicists think that virtue ethics can help solve this. Likewise, they also argue that other theories, conceptions of the right, are too algorithmic. Again, when we think about algorithms, we think about strict methodologies. The principle of double effect, for example, that we saw in natural law theory, was almost like a computer program. And in fact, one could probably write it as a computer program. Very, very similar with regards to the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative, or the way in which utilitarianism looks to evaluate utility between actions. The belief that other theories of the right are too algorithmic, ultimately it's kind of a derivative of the question of abstraction, or the objection related to abstraction. Virtue ethics believes that the application of judgment to moral situations is a virtue of the theory, no pun intended. Likewise, virtue ethics claims that other theories don't really account for the motivational behavioral component of virtue. So that is, whenever Kant describes the only moral virtue as being that of acting in accordance with acting in accordance with duty, or that is from the sole motive of duty, the virtue ethicist is saying that that doesn't really give us a reason for acting or tell us how we should act. Virtues can be known apart from the right, according to virtue ethics. That is, that we can consider what virtuous action and characteristics look like before we even have a conception of what right action may look like. And last, other theories only define a virtue as a disposition, which denies complexity of virtue. Again, if we consider that, for example, in Kant, that a virtuous disposition leads us to act out of the right duty, or the right motive, we ultimately ignore a lot of ways in which virtue is defined, or virtue may be considered. According to virtue ethics, we can get a rich understanding of virtue through this theory. Now, because virtue ethics has kind of demonstrated itself and kind of set itself up as such opposition to other forms of ethics, it's important for us to also look at how those theories may object to virtue ethics. These include objections such as the following. Virtue ethics provides indeterminate verdicts due to the nature of phronesis. Remember that phronesis was practical judgment or practical intelligence. Virtue ethicists argue against this by saying that indeterminacy, again, is a virtue of the theory. That is, that because moral phenomena are complex, we should be able to accept the complexity and indeterminacy involved in practical judgment and practical intelligence. So we see a very similar move made here that we saw in moral pluralism. They're saying that phronesis is an advantage because it allows for the theory to match reality. Moving on to our second objection. Explaining right conduct in terms of character traits which confer rightness to virtues because it is good. Is this an unexplained brute fact or not? Basically, this is almost a similar question to the Euthyphro question. That is a virtue good because it's good in itself, or does it receive its goodness because of something else? Well, according to the virtue ethicist, certain virtues are intrinsically good and self-evident. So, for example, if we consider virtues of temperance, we can see that moderation seems to be helpful. And we may not need to necessarily go through and create arguments to justify it. We may be able to look simply at the nature of the world. Likewise, they may argue that virtues are good in terms of their contribution to eudaimonia. Now, this is a particularly critical problem for virtue ethics, because if this objection is valid, just as we saw with the Euthyphro objection to divine command theory, this could challenge the way in which we explain why something is right or wrong. Ultimately, answers to this are a little fuzzy with regards to virtue ethics, just as they're fuzzy with regards to divine command theory of Euthyphro. Our third objection: how do you determine virtue and vice without avoiding relativism? To answer this, the virtue ethicist states that virtues contribute to eudaimonia, whereas vices do not. Now, this may require us to have a very rich and very full understanding of eudaimonia. In essence, a pluralistic understanding. If we have a pluralistic understanding of what contributes to the good life, then we may end up being able to avoid relativism in general. So when we evaluate virtue ethics, we seem to be in a pretty good place as well. It seems that it's important for ethics to be able to tell us something more about what kind of person we should be, not just about what right action is. After all, if a person is perhaps a very evil character, but is doing right things, we usually don't praise that person. As such, we can say that virtue ethics meets our standard of intuitive appeal. It also seems to have some logic behind it, which implies our moral beliefs, so therefore it meets our criteria for internal support. We may look at consistency through the use of phronesis, and from the decision-making procedure that we see. Now, a pluralistic vision of this theory may be more plausible than a monistic theory. We get indeterminacy just as we do in any pluralistic theory. Now, it's important to note here that, again, the explanatory power of the theory may be weakened if we consider a Euthyphro-like objection. So while the theory may seem to pass, it's quite arguable that it does not.